Many social changes took place under Islam between 610 and 661, including the period of Muhammad's mission and the rule of his four immediate successors who established the Rashidun Caliphate. Historians generally agree that changes in areas such as social security, family structure, slavery and the rights of women improved on what was present in existing Arab society. For example, according to Lewis, Islam from the first denounced aristocratic privilege, rejected hierarchy, and adopted a formula of the career open to the talents. Advent of Islam. Bernard Lewis believes that the advent of Islam was a revolution which only partially succeeded due to tensions between the new religion and very old societies that the Muslims conquered. He thinks that one such area of tension was a consequence of what he sees as the egalitarian nature of Islamic doctrine. Islam from the first denounced aristocratic privilege, rejected hierarchy, and adopted a formula of the career open to the talents. Lewis, however, notes that the equality in Islam was restricted to free adult male Muslims, but even that represented a very considerable advance on the practice of both the Greco-Roman and the ancient Iranian world. Bernard Lewis writes about the significance of Muhammad's achievements. Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina, also known as the Charter of Medina, was drafted by Muhammad in 622. It constituted a formal agreement between Muhammad and all of the significant tribes and families of Yathrib, including Muslims, Jews, and pagans. The document was drawn up with the explicit concern of bringing to an end the bitter intertribal fighting between the clans of the Aws and Banu Khazraj within Medina. To this effect, it instituted a number of rights and responsibilities for the Muslim, Jewish, and pagan communities of Medina, bringing them within the fold of one community, the Ummah. The precise dating of the Constitution of Medina remains debated, but generally scholars agree it was written shortly after the Hijrah. It effectively established the first Islamic state. The Constitution established the security of the community, religious freedoms, the role of Medina as a sacred place, the security of women, stable tribal relations within Medina, a tax system for supporting the community in time of conflict, parameters for exogenous political alliances, a system for granting protection of individuals, a judicial system for resolving disputes, and also regulated the paying of blood-white. Social changes. Practices. John Esposito sees Muhammad as a reformer who condemned practices of the pagan Arabs such as female infanticide, exploitation of the poor, usury, murder, false contracts, fornication, adultery, and theft. He states that Muhammad's insistence that each person was personally accountable not to tribal customary law but to an overriding divine law shook the very foundations of Arabian society. Muhammad proclaimed a sweeping program of religious and social reform that affected religious belief and practices, business contracts and practices, male, female and family relations. Esposito holds that the Quran's reforms consist of regulations and moral guidance that limit to redefine rather than prohibit or replace existing practices. He cites slavery and women's status as two examples. According to some scholars, Muhammad's condemnation of infanticide was the key aspect of his attempts to raise the status of women. Regarding the prevalence of this practice, we know it was common enough among the pre-Islamic Arabs to be assigned a specific term, wadi. A much-cited verse the Quran that addresses this practice is, "When the sun shall be darkened, when the stars shall be thrown down, when the mountains shall be set moving, when the pregnant camels shall be neglected, when the savage beasts shall be misted, when the seas shall be set boiling, when the souls shall be coupled, when the buried infant shall be asked for what sin she was slain, when the scrolls shall be unrolled. Social Security. William Montgomery Watt states that Muhammad was both a social and moral reformer. He asserts that Muhammad created a new system of social security and a new family structure, both of which were a vast improvement on what went before. By taking what was best in the morality of the nomad and adapting it for settled communities, he established a religious and social framework for the life of many races of men. If the prisoners were in the custody of a person, then the responsibility was on the individual. Slavery. The Quran makes numerous references to slavery, regulating but thereby also implicitly accepting this already existing institution. Lewis states that Islam brought two major changes to ancient slavery which were to have far-reaching consequences. One of these was the presumption of freedom, the other, the ban on the enslavement of free persons except in strictly defined circumstances. Lewis continues, the position of the Arabian slave was enormously improved. The Arabian slave was now no longer merely a chattel but was also a human being with a certain religious and hence a social status and with certain quasi-legal rights. Lewis states that in Muslim lands slaves had a certain legal status and had obligations as well as rights to the slave owner, an improvement over slavery in the ancient world. Due to these reforms, the practice of slavery in the Islamic Empire represented a vast improvement on that inherited from antiquity, from Rome, and from Byzantium. Although there are many common features between the institution of slavery in the Quran and that of neighboring cultures, however, the Quranic institution had some unique new features. According to Jonathan Brockhoff, professor of history and religious studies, the idea of using arms for the manumission of slaves appears to be unique to the Quran. Similarly, the practice of freeing slaves in atonement for certain sins appears to be introduced by the Quran. Brockhoff adds that other cultures limit a master's right to harm a slave but few exhort masters to treat the slaves kindly, and the placement of slaves in the same category as other weak members of society who deserve protection is unknown outside the Quran. The unique contribution of the Quran, then, is to be found in its emphasis on the place of slaves in society and society's responsibility toward the slave, perhaps the most progressive legislation on slavery in its time. Women's rights. To evaluate the effect of Islam on the status of women, many writers have discussed the status of women in pre-Islamic Arabia, and the findings have been mixed. Some writers have argued that women before Islam were more liberated, drawing most often on the first marriage of Muhammad and that of Muhammad's parents, but also in other points such as worship of female idols at Mecca. Other writers, on the contrary, have argued that women's status in pre-Islamic Arabia was poor, citing practices of female infanticide, unlimited polygyny, patrilineal marriage and others. Valentine Moffedam analyzes the situation of women from a Marxist theoretical framework and argues that the position of women are mostly influenced by the extent of urbanization, industrialization, proletarization and political ploys of the state manages rather than culture or intrinsic properties of Islam. Islam, Moffedam argues, is neither more nor less patriarchal than other world religions, especially Hinduism, Christianity and Judaism. Majid Qadiri writes that under the Arabian pre-Islamic law of status, women had virtually no rights. Sharia, however, provided women with a number of rights. John Esposito states that the reforms affected marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Women were not accorded with such legal status in other cultures, including the West, until centuries later. The Oxford Dictionary of Islam states that the general improvement of the status of Arab women included prohibition of female infanticide, and recognizing women's full personhood. Gerhard Endres states, the social system built up a new system of marriage, family and inheritance. This system treated women as an individual too and guaranteed social security to her as well as to her children. Legally controlled polygamy was an important advance on the various loosely defined arrangements which had previously been both possible and current. It was only by this provision that the family, the core of any sedentary society, could be placed on a firm footing. Muhammad also emphasized the importance of the mother figure, and it is reported in many hadiths in which Muhammad has stated the mother is of very high status. One hadith records that Abu Hurairah reported that a person said, Allah's Messenger, who are amongst the people, is most deserving of my good treatment. He said, your mother, again your mother, again your mother, then your father, then your nearest relatives. According to the order, marriage under the Arabian pre-Islamic law, no limitations were set on men's rights to marry or to obtain a divorce. Islamic law, however, restricted polygamy. The institution of marriage, characterized by unquestioned male superiority in the pre-Islamic law of status, was redefined and changed into one in which the woman was somewhat of an interested partner. For example, the dowry, previously regarded as a bride price paid to the father, became a nuptial gift retained by the wife as part of her personal property. Under Islamic law, marriage was no longer viewed as a status but rather as a contract. The essential elements of the marriage contract were now an offer by the man, an acceptance by the woman, and the performance of such conditions as the payment of dowry. The woman's consent was imperative. Furthermore, the offer and acceptance had to be made in the presence of at least two witnesses. A man was not allowed to leave his wife and marry someone else just because the other women pleased him more. A married woman also had rights over the husband, as stated by Muhammad, that you have your rights upon your wives and they have the rights upon you. Your right is that they shall not allow anyone you dislike to trample your bed and do not permit those whom you dislike to enter your home. The right is that you should treat them well in the matter of food and clothing, inheritance and wealth. Women were given inheritance rights in a patriarchal society that had previously restricted inheritance to male relatives, and Marie Schimmel states that, compared to the pre-Islamic position of women, Islamic legislation meant an enormous progress. The woman has the right, at least according to the letter of the law, to administer the wealth she has brought into the family or has earned by her own work. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Islam, women were also granted the right to live in the matrimonial home and receive financial maintenance during marriage and a waiting period following the death and divorce. The status of women states that Islam is still, in many ways, a man's religion. However, he states that Muhammad, in the historical context of his time, can be seen as a figure who testified on behalf of women's rights and improved things considerably. What explains the historical context surrounding women's rights at the time of Muhammad? It appears that in some parts of Arabia, notably in Mecca, a matrilineal system was in the process of being replaced by a patrilineal one at the time of Muhammad. Growing prosperity caused by a shifting of trade routes was accompanied by a growth in individualism. Men were amassing considerable personal wealth and wanted to be sure that this would be inherited by their own actual sons, and not simply by an extended family of the sisters' sons. This led to a deterioration in the rights of women. At the time Islam began, the conditions of women were terrible. They had no right to own property, were supposed to be the property of the man, and if the man died, everything went to his sons. Muhammad, however, by instituting rights of property ownership, inheritance, education and divorce, gave women certain basic safeguards. In the earliest centuries of Islam, Islam, the position of women was not bad at all. Only over the course of centuries was she increasingly confined to the house and was forced to veil herself. The Quran and Muhammad's example were more favorable to the security and status of women than history and later Muslim practice might suggest. For example, the Quran does not require women to wear veils, rather, it was a social habit picked up with the expansion of Islam. In fact, since it was impractical for working women to wear veils, a veiled woman silently announced that her husband was rich enough to keep her idle. Haddad and Esposito state that, although Islam is often criticized for the low status it has ascribed to women, many scholars believe that it was primarily the interpretation of jurists' local traditions and social trends which brought about a decline in the status of Muslim women. In this view, Muhammad granted women rights and privileges in the sphere of family life, marriage, education, and economic endeavors, rights that help improve women's status in society. However, the Arab Bedouins were dedicated to custom and tradition and resisted changes brought by the new religion. Haddad and Esposito state that in this view, the inequality of Muslim women happened because of the pre-existing habits of the people among whom Islam took root. The economics of these early Muslim societies were not favorable to comfortable life for women. More important, during Islam's 2nd and 3rd centuries, the interpretation of the Quran was in the hands of deeply conservative scholars, whose decisions are not easy to challenge today. The Quran is more favorable to women than is generally realized. In principle, except for a verse or two, the Quran grants women equality. For example, Eve was not the delayed product of Adam's rib. The two were born from a single soul. It was Adam, not Eve, who let the devil convince them to eat the forbidden fruit. Muslim women are instructed to be modest in their dress, but only in general terms. Men are also told to be modest. Many Muslims believe the veiling and seclusion are later male inventions, social habits picked up with the conquest of the Byzantine and Persian empires. Children. The Quran rejected the pre-Islamic idea of children as the father's property and abolished the pre-Islamic custom of adoption. Giladi holds the Quran's rejection of the idea of children as the father's property was a Judeo-Christian influence and was a response to the challenge of structural changes in tribal society. The Quran also replaced the pre-Islamic custom of adoption by the recommendation that believers treat children of unknown origin as their brothers in the faith and clients. Adoption was viewed as a lie, as an artificial tie between adults and children, devoid of any real emotional relationship, as a cause of confusion where lineage was concerned and thus a possible source of problems regarding marriage between members of the same family, and regarding inheritance. But a child that was not born into a family can still be raised by a foster family, but the child must retain his identity, such as his last name and lineage. The Prophet has stated that a person who assists and aids an orphan is on the same footing in heaven to the Prophet himself. Sociological changes. Sociologist Robert N. Beale argues that Islam in its 7th century origins was, for its time and place, remarkably modern, in the high degree of commitment, involvement and participation expected from the rank-and-file members of the community. Quote, "This because," he argues, "that Islam emphasized on the equality of all Muslims. Leadership positions were open to all. However, there were restraints on the early Muslim community that kept it from exemplifying these principles, primarily from the stagnant localisms of tribe and kinship." Dale I. Kelman writes that Beale suggests the early Islamic community placed a particular value on individuals, as opposed to collective or group responsibility. The Islamic idea of community, established by Muhammad, is flexible in social, religious, and political terms, and includes a diversity of Muslims who share a general sense of common cause and consensus concerning beliefs and individual and communal actions. Moral changes. Muslims believe that Muhammad, like other prophets in Islam, was sent by God to remind human beings of their moral responsibility, and challenged those ideas in society which opposed submission to God. According to Caliphate, this challenge was directed against 5 main characteristics of pre-Islamic Arabia: the division of Arabs into varying tribes. This categorization was confronted by the ideal of a unified community based upon taqwa and ummah, the acceptance of the worship of a multitude of deities besides Allah, a view challenged by strict tawhid, which dictates that Allah has no partner in worship nor any equal, the trait of murufwa, which Islam discouraged, instead emphasizing on the traits of humility and piety, the focus on achieving fame or establishing a legacy, which was replaced by the concept that mankind would be called to account before God on the Qiyamah, the reverence of and compliance with ancestral traditions, a practice challenged by Islam, which instead assigned primacy to submitting to God and following revelation. These changes lay in the reorientation of society as regards to identity, worldview, and the hierarchy of values. For the viewpoint of subsequent generations, this caused a great transformation in the society and moral order of life in the Arabian Peninsula. For Muhammad, although pre-Islamic Arabia exemplified heedlessness, it was not entirely without merit. Muhammad approved and exhorted certain aspects of the Arab pre-Islamic tradition, such as the care for one's near kin, for widows, orphans, and others in need, and for the establishment of justice. However, these values would be reordered in importance and placed in the context of strict monotheism. Although Muhammad's preaching produced a radical change in moral values based on the sanctions of the new religion, and fear of God and of the Last Judgment, the pre-Islamic tribal practices of the Arabs by no means completely died out. Economic changes. Michael Bonner writes on poverty and economics in the Quran that the Quran provided a blueprint for a new order in society, in which the poor would be treated more fairly than before. This economy of poverty prevailed in Islamic theory and practice up until the 13th and 14th centuries. At its heart was a notion of property circulated and purified, in part, through charity, which illustrates a distinctively Islamic way of conceptualizing charity, generosity, and poverty, markedly different from the Christian notion of perennial reciprocity between rich and poor, and the ideal of charity as an expression of community love. The Quran prohibits bad kind of circulation and asks for good circulation. Some of the recipients of charity appear only once in the Quran, and others, such as orphans, parents, and beggars, reappear constantly. Most common is the triad of kinsfolk, poor, and travelers. Unlike pre-Islamic Arabian society, the Quranic idea of economic circulation as a return of goods and obligations was for everyone, whether donors and recipients know each other or not, in which goods move, and society does what it is supposed to do. The Quran's distinctive set of economic and social arrangements, in which poverty and the poor have important roles, show signs of newness. The Quran told that the guidance comes to a community that regulates its flow of money and goods in the right direction and practices generosity as reciprocation for God's bounty. In a broad sense, the narrative underlying the Quran is that of a tribal society becoming urbanized. Many scholars have characterized both the Quran and Islam as highly favorable to commerce and to the highly mobile type of society that emerged in the medieval Near East. Muslim tradition maintains that Muhammad did not permit the construction of any buildings in the market of Medina other than mere tents, nor did he permit any tax or rent to be taken there. This expression of a free market, involving the circulation of goods within a single space without payment of fees, taxes, or rent, without the construction of permanent buildings, and without any profiting on the part of the caliphal authority, was rooted in the term sadaqah, voluntary alms. Quote, "This coherent and highly appealing view of the economic universe had much to do with Islam's early and lasting success. Since the poor were at the heart of this economic universe, the teachings of the Quran on poverty had a considerable, even a transforming effect in Arabia, the Near East, and beyond." Civil changes. During the Caliphate, the Muslims repaired many of the aging wells in the lands they conquered. In addition to wells, the Muslims built many tanks and canals. While some canals were excluded for the use of monks and the needy, most canals were open to general public use. Some canals were constructed between settlements, such as the Saad Canal that provided water to Anbar, and the Abi Musa Canal to providing water to Basra. During a famine, Umar ordered the construction of a canal in Egypt to connect the Nile with the Red Sea. The purpose of the canal was to facilitate the transport of grain to Arabia through a sea route, hitherto transported only by land. The canal was constructed within a year by Amr ibn al-As, and Abdus Salam Nadiv writes, Arabia was rid of famine for all the times to come.